Next on AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show. Here's Brian O'Neill.
And what we're going to do today with Dr. Gary Ostrower, I'm going to go through a list of not of all the U.S. presidential elections, but a lot of them, and the big ones, the ones you remember. And I'm using the History Channel's website to do this. Dr. Ostrower, as always, thanks for joining us. And before we get going, was there anything you wanted to say?
Well, yeah, I do. George Washington was, of course, the first elected president of the U.S., and he was elected with the only unanimous vote of the entire Electoral College. No one else ever received that. As a matter of fact, in 1820, when James Monroe was elected president, he ran alone. That is to say, he had no opposition, and yet even he didn't get a unanimous electoral college, and that was because one elector refused to vote for Monroe, and the reason he refused was because he wanted Washington to be the only president ever elected with that unanimous vote.
That's very interesting. Thanks for starting it out that way. Now moving on to, as George W. Bush said, another George W. We fast forward to the year 2000. George W. Bush versus Al Gore, and I believe Ralph Nader was in that race too.
Boy, was he ever. It was a very, very close race, and a lot of people who voted for Nader came to regret it because, in all likelihood, if they had any idea, at least if living in Florida, because Florida became the key state in terms of the Electoral College, and the election would be decided in Florida by, the millions of people who voted, by all of 547 votes. Ralph Nader got about 4,000 votes, and almost surely 90%, maybe 95% of those Nader votes would otherwise have gone to Al Gore, Senator Al Gore, who had been the vice president under Bill Clinton. So, because Nader was there, the balance of power, so to speak, during the election went toward George Bush, and he barely survived that election. Now, there were other things involved with that. There are a lot of people who had apparently thought that they had voted for Gore, but because of what they called hanging chads, these little nibs on the
dimpled chads and hanging chads.
Hanging chads, yeah. And so, many of those votes were not counted. So in all likelihood, had the election been run in a more traditional way without these so-called hanging chads, let's say simply, people checking yes or no or whatever it is, checking the names of one of the people on the ballot with a pencil and a paper, in all likelihood, Gore would have won in Florida, and therefore Gore would have won nationally. But, of course, that never happened. Eventually, the case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, on a purely partisan basis, cut off the recount in Florida, and so Mr. Bush won the election.
Going back to 1992 here, Bill Clinton versus George H.W. Bush versus Ross Perot.
Yeah, and Ross Perot did pretty well. He got about 18% of the vote. And many people said that, had he not been running, then in all likelihood George Bush would have won. But we really don't know that. As a matter of fact, there were people, there were polls, of course, by this time, the Harris poll, the Gallup poll, and they surveyed people who had voted for Ross Perot. Remember, Ross Perot was a businessman from Texas. He was the head of Texas Instruments, a big computer company. He was kind of a maverick sort of a guy, and he was, unhappy, obviously, with both of the regular party candidates. In any case, they had interviewed many voters who had voted for Ross Perot, and for the most part, they had split. About half of them said, yeah, had Perot not been running, I would have voted for Clinton, and the other half said, had he not been running, I would have voted for George Bush. And so we really don't know that Ross Perot had any particular impact on that election. What we do know, of course, is that George Bush, who had been wildly popular after the first Gulf War, when he had a favorable rating of close to 90%. I don't know that any president in modern times has had that favorable a rating. Yet, just about a year and a half later, managed to lose the election.
1980, President Jimmy Carter versus Ronald Reagan, and John Anderson was in that race too as an independent.
Well, needless to say, of course, Reagan won. and he won fairly substantially. And the reason he won, in all likelihood, again, we kind of speculate as historians, but Carter was hobbled by the Iran hostage crisis. Initially, 55 Americans had been taken hostage by the Iranians right inside the American embassy. About 10 of them were eventually rescued, but the other 44 remained there for 444 days. And it became a symbol, in a sense, of, or at least was viewed as a symbol of American weakness, as a degree to which the U.S. was kind of powerless in the face of this radical activity by a unpleasant regime, a very religious regime, a fundamentalist Muslim regime, and poor Mr. Carter took the brunt, so to speak, of all of that anger. And so, it's not all that common where an incumbent will lose an election, but that certainly happened in 1980. Reagan, of course, went on to become extremely popular when he ran 4 years later in 1984. He ran against Carter's vice president, a man by the name of Walter Mondale from Minnesota, and Reagan won almost every state. If I'm not mistaken, he even took the electoral vote in the state of Minnesota, which was Mondale's own state, the only state that President Reagan did not win the electoral vote in was Massachusetts, very liberal Massachusetts.
Dr. Ostrower, JFK versus Richard Nixon in 1960. They were running to succeed President Dwight D. Eisenhower, a World War II general and war hero. Many conservatives insist JFK stole the election in Chicago, thanks to the help of Mayor Daley in November of 1960. Any truth to that?
We don't know who really won the election in this sense. In terms of the popular vote, it was a very, very close election. Kennedy would receive 130,000 votes more than did Nixon. Now, that was out of somehow, I think, if I'm not mistaken, around 65 million people who had voted. That's an awfully, awfully close election. And what it really means is that if one single person in each election precinct in the United States of America had switched their vote from Nixon to Kennedy, Kennedy probably would have won. From Kennedy to Nixon, Nixon would have become president in 1960. It was a very, very close election. So far as Chicago is concerned, I don't think there's any question, at least in my own mind as a historian, that Kennedy benefited from some election irregularities in Chicago. But by the same token, in that very, very important swing state of Illinois, which eventually Kennedy would win by a narrow margin, in southern Illinois, they went very, very heavily for Nixon. And there is evidence that, and I don't know how hard this is, but there's certainly evidence that the same kind of voting shenanigans that happened favoring Kennedy in Chicago happened in southern Illinois, but in that case, helping Nixon. So we really don't know. I think it's kind of a toss-up. My hunch is that Kennedy won the election in Illinois legitimately, but I don't think that either side, neither Republicans nor Democrats, come out with a great deal of electoral prestige in light of what we know today.
And not to get sidetracked, but I was watching Fox News on over the weekend. I think it was Saturday night, and it was a show, and the host said that JFK and LBJ both used to use the IRS against political enemies. Is there any truth to that?
I have no idea if there is truth to that. I have not heard that. I have not read that. I certainly don't automatically believe what I hear. It's possible that they did, but I'm simply not aware of it. And if I was aware of it, that is to say, if they had done this, I'm not quite sure against whom, in what circumstances, and how it would have worked.
Eisenhower in the 1950s, President Dwight D. Eisenhower, Ike as they called him, ran against Democrat Adlai Stevenson 2 times, once in 1952 and once in 1956. Eisenhower is remembered because of war movies. Adlai Stevenson is pretty much forgotten. What do we know about Adlai Stevenson?
Adlai Stevenson was a governor of Illinois, Democrat. He was a very, very good governor, a lot of respect, which is one of the things that got him nominated for president in 1952 when he first ran. I do recall a situation where a woman had run up to him and said, Mr. Stevenson, every intelligent person is going to vote for you. And he looked at her and he said, well, unfortunately, there are just not enough of them. And he was right in a way because, of course, he lost the election. But Eisenhower was very popular. He was a war hero. He had commanded American troops in the European theater during World War II. He then went on to become the head of Columbia, the president of Columbia University. And as a matter of fact, he was so popular that the Democrats in 1952 had sent feelers to see whether he might be willing to run as a Democrat. And when, of course, he did not, he then accepted the Republican nomination. But I think it would have been difficult for any Democrat to have defeated Eisenhower in 1952. But, Brian, I want to say something, if I can.
Go ahead.
About an election in the 1840s, not just an election, but elections generally.
Go ahead.
Way back in the 19th century, in the period between about 1828, when Andy Jackson became president of the United States, when he was elected, and about the beginning of the Civil War. And what I want to say is that back during that period, and this is, prior to 1828, very, very few members of the public actually voted. Most of the elections were simply held with members of the Electoral College casting ballots. And then beginning in 1828, as more and more members of the public voted, the property qualifications for voting had ended by that time. Okay, then, the elections became more popular. And as they became more popular, issues were no longer as important as personalities. And slogans became important, in contrast to, once again, a kind of serious discussion of the issues. But what was, I think, also really, really kind of interesting is that during that period, you had elections spread throughout the entire year. So you might have local elections in January, county elections in March, Board of Education elections, if there were Board of Educations, in April. You would have senatorial elections in September, members of the House of Representatives in November, and also, of course, not every 4 years, the president in November. So you had these elections all throughout the year. And what was, I think, particularly interesting is that a lot of people voted. Many, many more people voted back in that period than vote today. And the reason is, or at least I think the reason is, that elections in many ways were a kind of national entertainment. They didn't have the NFL. They didn't have the NBA. They didn't have Major League Baseball. They didn't have really good movies. There was no internet. There was no Facebook. There were no Broadway plays back in that period. If people wanted entertainment, whether they lived in cities or they lived in small towns, they went to political rallies. And so the Democrats on one side, that was Andy Jackson's party, and the Whigs that became eventually the Republicans on the other side would hold these rallies. They would have bonfires, they would have parades, they would have parties, they would feed everyone who was there, and it was all a matter of kind of fishing for votes. And by golly, it worked in the sense that many, many, many more people came out to vote as a result of the degree to which, as I'm saying, elections were entertainment.
Talking to Dr. Gary Ostrower. We cannot leave out FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who ran against Herbert Hoover in 1932, Alfred Landon in 1936, Wendell Willkie in 1940, and Thomas Dewey in, 44? Dr. Ostrower, how was it that FDR was so successful?
Well, he was a very, very appealing individual. He offered a program, a New Deal program, it's sort of a little bit like Bernie Sanders, but not quite as socialist-oriented during the New Deal. And he really spoke to people who were genuinely down and out, people who were losing their homes, people who had lost their jobs. 25% of the American public was unemployed, and another 25% were underemployed. In other words, they only had part-time work when they would have liked full-time work. And FDR started, he sponsored programs that put many of these people back to work. Not entirely. The Depression wasn't ended until World War II, but FDR, because of these programs, became immensely popular. In 1936, when he ran against Al Landon, he received over 60% of the popular vote. It was one of the largest margins of victory in all of American history. He was an American hero, and I would also say he was a superb president. He was one of the three top presidents that we have ever elected, the others being George Washington and Abraham Lincoln.
Talking to Dr. Gary Ostrower. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back here on Election Day 2019, November 5th, 2019, in just a moment.
I hear ads on the radio talk about the IRS Fresh Start program. Does Cunningham Storing & Associates do that?
The Fresh Start program, also called Offer and Compromise, allows people to pay off their taxes for less than they owe. But it only works for some people. We have over a decade of success. Call us to determine if we can help you.
What about back taxes?
We help people file multiple years back tax returns. Don't hide any longer.
If you need help from Cunningham Storing & Associates, you can find us in Hornell at 91 Washington Street or on the web at hornelltax.com.
Checking in now with meteorologist Rob Carolyn, who says colder and colder.
That's right, Brian. In fact, we could be talking about some snow towards the end of the week, believe it or not. Certainly going to be a wild pattern as we head through this week. As we talked about last week, it looked like at least the first 2 weeks of November would be below normal, and that is certainly going to play out quite well over the course of the next 5 to 10 days. We've got a lot of cloudiness out there this morning, Brian. Some showers moving through. They're associated with the first in a series of fronts that'll be coming through. Temperatures today up close to 50. Sunrise this morning was at 6:48. The sun sets tonight at 5 o'clock since we've gone back to standard time. We're partly cloudy overnight and cold, lows 25 to 30. Tomorrow, look for sunshine to start. Another front heads our way, so clouds will increase tomorrow afternoon, highs only around 45. Rain and snow showers late tomorrow night, 30 to 35. And Brian will see periods of rain and wet snow Thursday, highs 35 to 40. That precipitation winds down late Thursday night, early Friday morning.
Back with Dr. Gary Ostrower, 1896 election. William McKinley versus William Jennings Bryan.
Well, that is the famous Cross of Gold election. McKinley was a conservative Republican. McKinley had the support of big business, and he had the support of a lot of people who, to one extent or another, relied on big business. And elections weren't all that fair back in that period. Many, many employers had said to their employees, if you don't vote for McKinley, don't bother coming to work tomorrow. In other words, if McKinley loses the election, don't bother coming to work tomorrow. Well, needless to say, that kind of put the fear of God into many people who might otherwise have voted for the Democrat, who is William Jennings Bryan. And I might add, by the way, that in many states in 1896, there was no secret ballot. So you went into a bar, or maybe you went into a school or something along those lines, but often in bars, and you cast your ballot, and you cast your ballot openly. So if you didn't vote for the right candidate, your boss would know it. So yes, indeed, it was a very, very, kind of a nasty election. William Jennings Bryan was a fundamentalist. He was an evangelical. He was also very much a champion of the little guy, of the small farmers, and he very much opposed what at that time was supported by most of the wealthy people in the country, namely the gold standard. He wanted to, take the country off the gold standard, and it was on that basis that when he gave his when he gave his acceptance speech at the Democratic National Convention, he said to the Republicans, "You shall not crucify us on a cross of gold." It became a line that, to a certain extent, is still remembered by American historians who talk about, presidential elections.
1860, Abe Lincoln versus Stephen Douglas. And then they also have in the names, this is from the History Channel, John Breckinridge and John Bell.
Yeah, there were 4 candidates. One candidate, of course, the one who won the election, Abraham Lincoln, did not appear on a single ballot in the South. In other words, in every real sense of the word, he was a sectional candidate, not a national candidate. Not one single one of the states that became the Confederacy just less than a year later. Not one of them had Lincoln on the ballot. So to win the presidency, he won a plurality, not a majority of the popular vote. But he won that plurality in the North, obviously, and in the West, and not in the South. It was one of the most consequential elections, if not the most consequential election in all of American history. Lincoln put together a superb campaign. He reached out to many of his rivals in the Republican Party. There was a new Republican Party. This was only the second time the Republicans had ever run a candidate for president. We shouldn't think that parties are forever, because the Whig Party, which had lasted for about 20 or 25 years, had disappeared during the 1850s, and out of the ashes of the Whig Party arose this new Republican Party. They first ran a guy named John Fremont, a general, for president in 1856, and then Lincoln in 1860. So yeah, he won the election, but as I say, he won it without Southern support. There were those other three candidates. John Breckinridge he came from Kentucky, and he was the Democratic candidate for president. Stephen Douglas was the Democratic candidate for president, but John Breckinridge ran as a Southern pro-slavery Democrat for Congress. So what you had, in other words, were some people who were anti-slave, some people obviously who were pro-slavery. That was certainly the case with Breckinridge. And then you had this fellow by the name of John Bell, who came from the South, but he was what we call a constitutional union candidate, meaning, in other words, that he supported, that he opposed secession, that he opposed the South breaking away to become a separate state. He just didn't get very many votes. In the South, Breckinridge got most votes. In the North, Lincoln, of course, got most votes, and of course, Lincoln got the electoral majority in that election.
Why are the Lincoln-Douglas debates considered so important?
Because Lincoln was virtually unknown nationally at the time that they had the debates. Lincoln had been, back in the 1840s, just for about 2 years, he had been a congressman from Illinois. He was a lawyer. He was, somewhat moderately well-known in Illinois, but not very, very much. I would guess that the man on the street in 1856 or 1857 probably could not have identified Abraham Lincoln. And Douglas was the leader of the Democrats in the United States Senate. He was more well-known, he was better known than any other single Democrat in the United States in that year, with the single exception of the president, whose name was James Buchanan. And so Douglas agreed to these debates. Remember, back in this period, the public didn't vote for the candidate. The candidate was the senators were elected by the lower house of each state legislature. Nevertheless, they appealed to the public. The idea was that the public would let the senators know who they supported, and then maybe the senators would vote for that candidate. Be it as it may, they agreed to 6 debates in Illinois in 1858. This is, remember, not a presidential election; it was a senatorial election. They went around the state, and Lincoln, who was a superb lawyer and a very funny guy, had a great sense of humor and an excellent debater, was able to back Douglas into some positions that Douglas simply was unable, in a sense, to adequately explain. In one case, he said something to the effect that the North could ban slavery in a lot of different northern states. Okay, the Southerners wanted slavery extended even into the North back in that period, and it so alienated people in the South that Douglas did not himself wind up on the ballot in many southern states. As I say, this fellow John Breckinridge, who was also a Democrat but a pro-slavery Democrat, ran in many of the southern states. So poor Mr. Douglas had backed himself into a corner, and he was never able to emerge from the dilemma that he had created for himself.
Down to the last couple of minutes, Dr. Ostrower. 1800, Thomas Jefferson versus John Adams.
Well, it was one heck of an election. It was, the election in 2016 was, of course, rather nasty. I expect that the election in 2020 is going to be even more nasty, certainly on the part of, the fellow who occupies the White House. But that kind of nastiness was also somewhat, and I don't want to say it's quite the same thing, but there are analogies here, similar to what we saw back in the year 1800. He said that was during the period of the French Revolution, and the Federalists, that was the party of George Washington and John Adams was running for president. John Adams was running against the Democrat-Republican, called a Democratic-Republican. Today we would call him a Democrat, Thomas Jefferson. And what Adams argued was that Jefferson, if he won the election, would essentially turn the United States over into a revolutionary France, that that aristocrats in this country, wealthy people, would be beheaded, that they'd be executed, that property would be taken from these people, and so forth. There was a lot of racial stuff going on because Jefferson had during that election or before the election an affair, a sexual affair with a slave by the name of Sally Hemings, and so that was thrown against Jefferson. So it was really very, very nasty. And I might add, by the way, that the Jeffersonians kind of replied in kind, and they were basically saying that John Adams was nothing more than a tool of the King of England, that he was essentially an aristocrat, that he hated the common people, and so forth and so on. There's a little bit to that, I might add, but needless to say, it was a very, very, very divisive election, as divisive as I suspect we're going to see. And I might say one last thing about the election of 1800. Jefferson understood fully how divisive it had been. Well, he won the election, and he won it very, very narrowly. And after he won, he delivered his inaugural address. And the first thing he says in that inaugural address is that we are all Federalists, we are all Republicans. We're all Federalists, we're all Republicans. Now, what he was essentially saying is that, look, we are Americans, and there's more that unites us than divides us. And therefore, let's not allow the kind of divisiveness that, by golly, we see today in 2020. Let's not allow that kind of divisiveness to destroy the United States of America.
Dr. Ostrower, I did want to do 2016, but we spent too much time on other elections. I will ask you this, though. In November 2020, it'll be President Trump on the ballot, we think. For the Republicans, who do you think will be on the ballot for the Democrats?
The $64 question, or
yeah.
The $64,000 question. I have a hunch that the Democratic candidate is going to be someone other than the people that we hear. It's not going to be Biden. It's not going to be Elizabeth Warren.
Hillary?
It's not going to be Kamala Harris. And the reason I say that is because I think that the Democrats want to win this election. And right now, I believe the Democrats are coming to believe, rightly or wrongly, that that Biden and that Elizabeth Warren cannot win. Okay, that there's Biden is simply too old, not sharp enough. That Elizabeth Warren is too far left, and consequently, I think toward the end, the Democrats are going to turn to a candidate, maybe Michelle Obama. Who knows who it's going to be? Maybe it's going to be Brian O'Neill, but it's going to be somebody who's going to that most of us are not thinking about right now.
Hillary?
Well, I doubt that. I can't imagine. Well, I can imagine it. Yeah, she might, but I don't think she would do it again. Who knows? Look, as I say on this program before, I'm pretty good about predicting what happened yesterday. I'm not so hot about predicting what's going to happen tomorrow.
With that, we have to go. Dr. Ostrower, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.